Who's on the bubble? We're breaking down the Falcons' 53-man roster as it stands today.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for basically 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me each and every day. We call you the everydayers, that you make this illustrious podcast your first listen or first watch each and every day. And to become an everydayer, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we're going to talk about why Natrone Brooks looked like a starting caliber corner against the Baltimore Ravens. We'll talk about, Michael Penix not playing. This will probably be the last time we talk about it on the pod. But I'll push back a little bit on some of the, let's say, less than smart narratives that I've heard on that defending Michael Penix is not playing in the last 24 hours. But first, let's talk about where the roster stands today after the Ravens game. I rewatched the game on Sunday morning. Nothing really jumped out to me that was worthy of lengthy discussion from that game. So instead, let's nerd out about the roster. And I feel like going into this final preseason game, about 47 out of the 53 roster spots are pretty much locked up, right? I think really the debate is who's going to be those last 6 guys, and, are they going to go outside the organization to fill some of those spots, or are they going to maintain certain guys that are already here? Now, of that 47, 20 of those near locks or virtual locks are on offense, and the 2 quarterbacks I think are locks are Kirk Cousins, Michael Penix. 3 running backs are Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, and Avery Williams. The 5 wide receivers are Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod, Kadero Hodge, and Casey Washington. 3 tight ends, Kyle Pitts, Charlie Warner, Waras Dwelly. 7 offensive linemen, Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Drew Dolman, Chris Lindstrom, Caleb McGarry, Storm Norton, and Ryan Newsel. Now, these last couple of spots that are still up for grabs, I think that's quarterback 3. I think that's very likely to be Taylor Heinicke. They'll probably keep Taylor Heinicke unless a trade happens. 2 of the biggest quarterback injuries that have occurred this summer have so far been Justin Herbert and J.J. McCarthy. It doesn't seem like the Chargers or Vikings are going to be that interested in making a trade for someone like Taylor Heinicke. I know Easton Stick, the Chargers' backup quarterback, has really struggled this summer, but I would bet that more likely if they're going to go outside the organization to get a new backup quarterback rather than Easton Stick, they'll probably get someone who's familiar with Greg Roman's offense, someone like Tyler Huntley, who's expected to be cut by the Browns. To me, right now, again, looking at the other 31 NFL teams, the only team that I think right now that has any real chance of trading for Taylor Heinicke, and again, things can change in the next 9 days between now and final cuts, but right now, to me, it's the Rams. With Jimmy Garoppolo suspended for the first 2 games of the season, Stetson Bennett being very up and down, you have Dave Ragone there in L.A. From Atlanta. I could see the Falcons and Rams potentially making a player-for-player trade where the Falcons get rid of Heinicke because they don't necessarily want to keep him, and the Rams give us somebody that they don't necessarily want to keep on their roster but don't want to give away, and someone that has, some experience, some value to this coaching staff. The players that I'm kind of circling, on the Rams roster that are kind of on the bubble, Tutu Atwell, the wide receiver, outside linebacker O'Shawn Mathis, backup guard Logan Bruss are some of the names that sort of stand out to me. But we'll see on that front. Now, RB4, I think we'll keep 4 running backs on the roster. I think that 4th running back is going to be Jase McClellan. I think Carlos Washington probably sticks on the practice squad, even though Washington, quote-unquote, started over Jase McClellan these last 2 games. I feel like Washington's made just a few too many mistakes in these games. He muffed a kickoff against Miami. He blew a protection against Baltimore. McClellan has been cleaner, plus he gets a bump from being the Falcons' 6th-round draft pick this past year. I think there's a chance that the Falcons keep 6 wide receivers. Currently, I'm projecting that right now, and I think Chris Blair is probably well ahead of everybody else for that 6th spot. But again, that could be an outside pickup. That could be a Tutu Atwell. That could be where a Juju Smith-Schuster potentially gets into the mix. Yes, we are back on Juju watch, right? I think the injury to Jakeem Grant, who the Falcons put on IR, and we talked about, Grant's value on special teams and whatnot, opens the door for the Falcons to carry a different 6 wide receiver than the current options. I doubt the Falcons are going to keep 4 tight ends on the roster, so I think John Fitzpatrick, at this point in time, who's the 4th tight end, is destined for the practice squad at best. But to me, at this point, it's kind of a toss-up between him and Austin Stogner in terms of who's going to be that 4th tight end kept on the practice squad. Maybe they keep both, but I don't see that necessarily happen. But the offensive linemen, we know they'll keep at least 8 offensive linemen. I have 7 of those 8 projected. They might keep 9. We'll see, right? I think the last 2 spots will come down to Kyle Hinton and or Javon Gwynn. If they keep 1, it's a toss-up between those 2 guys. I feel like Hinton did play better against the Ravens than he did against the Dolphins. I still don't think he was good against the Ravens, but I'd love to see the Falcons add someone off the waiver wire that's better than either Hinton or Gwynn. I don't think Gwynn has really made much improvement based off what I've seen in these 2 games in year 2. So if Gwynn does wind up sticking in the roster either as the 8th or 9th offensive lineman, it's mostly because Dwayne Ledford, the Falcons offensive line coach, has a soft spot for him and or he's a draft pick. So the 20 I named that I think are virtual locks, the 4 that I will say that I would probably put on my 53-man roster today right now, in addition to those 20, are Taylor Heinicke, Jase McClellan, Kyle Hinton, and Chris Blair. But we'll just sort of have to see what develops over the next, 9 days between now and final cuts, which will be Tuesday, August 27th. We'll turn our attention to the defense and break down where the roster stands at that. And we'll also get into why Natrone Brooks, played like a starter in this Ravens preseason game as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Passion, drive, patience, it is the formula for winning championships, and it's also what's going to keep your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts to fit your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guarantee Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car an MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guarantee Fit only available to U.S. customers. So I think there are roughly, 20 players on offense that are locks to make the roster. There are 24 on defense, and then the other 3 are on special teams, obviously. And so the 24 I have on defense are Matthew Judon, or I have, let's start with the 8 D linemen: Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Zach Harrison, Eddie Goldman, Taquan Graham, Brandon Doris, Aruka Roro, and Contavious Street. 4 edge rushers, outside linebackers, whatever you want to call them: Matthew Judon, Lorenzo Carter, Arnold Ebiketie, and James Smith-Williams. 4 inside linebackers: Caden Ellis, Troy Anderson, Nate Landman, J.D. Bertrand. 5 corners: A.J. Terrell, Mike Hughes, D. Alford, Clark Phillips, and Antonio Hamilton. And 3 safeties: Jesse Bates, Justin Simmons, and Richie Grant. And, of course, the 3 special teamers are Younghoe Koo, Bradley Pinion, and Liam McCullough, the Highlander. And so, I think ultimately on defense, we'll see the Falcons keep 25 or 26 players. So there's really only 1 or 2 spots left available, I think, fighting out. I think one of those spots is definitely going to be the 4th safety. That, to me, is a battle at this point between Dane Cruikshank and Micah Abernathy. Cruikshank didn't play against Baltimore. And so, we've been reading into if you didn't play against the Ravens, with a few exceptions, you're probably a lock to make the roster. But I think that absence in terms of Cruikshank was mostly due to injury, because he was dealing with an ankle injury all week long. So I don't think he's quite locked up a roster spot. But if I was betting today, I would probably lean more Abernathy, but it is close to a toss-up at this point in time. And I think this Jaguars game next week could help decide that outcome. I think that second spot, if they do wind up keeping 26 players on defense on the 53-man roster, that's where things get a lot more interesting, because to me, that's probably going to either be a fifth outside linebacker or a sixth corner. That fifth outside linebacker spot will be between Demone Harris and DeAngelo Malone. And that sixth cornerback spot, I think, is a three-way battle between Natrone Brooks, Anthony Johnson, and Kevin King. Now, we've seen Malone play virtually all the special team snaps through 2 preseason games, but Demone Harris has also had a lot of work on special teams. And Harris has been ahead of Malone consistently on the defensive depth chart. However, I do think the primary value of that fifth outside linebacker, the Falcons do decide to keep one, will be almost exclusively playing on special teams. They won't probably play really much at all on defense. And so for that reason, I would slightly lean Malone, but it's really a toss-up. I think both of these guys, regardless of Malone or Harris, are very likely to be practice squad guys. You do wonder a little bit, because Malone, that third-round pedigree, is he going to be more likely to be claimed off of waivers than Demone Harris is? Probably. And so I think that could also be a factor and variable. We saw that last year with the Falcons not cutting John Fitzpatrick because they were worried about him being scooped up off the waiver wire, and much to my chagrin, cutting Parker Hesse. Now, as far as the sixth cornerback spot goes, this is interesting. Obviously, Natrone Brooks had a big game on Saturday against the Ravens. But, you know, Anthony Johnson has been a regular quote unquote starter in terms of special teams coverage in both preseason games. I was reluctant to sort of consider Kevin King for this spot, despite how well he played against the Dolphins, just due to his lack of special teams value. But the fact is that his only snaps against the Ravens came on special teams. So clearly, I think the Falcons are sort of testing the waters. But because I also think, because Clark Phillips is going to make the team, I don't think the Falcons are going to keep 2 cornerbacks that don't bring a ton of special teams. Like, they play on special teams, but they're not really here because of their special teams ability. They're just playing on special teams because there's really nothing else. If you're the 4th or 6th corner in this case, there's really not a whole lot for you to do on Sundays, outside of a handful of snaps on special teams. And so to me, it's more likely that you're not going to keep 2 of those corners. So if Clark Phillips is a lock, that to me is the main reason why I don't think Kevin King is a lock, despite, how well he played against the Dolphins. Now, that's why I tend to think that if they do keep 6 corners, and currently I'm still projecting only 5 on the 53-man roster. Again, if push came to shove today, I'm picking DeAngelo Malone to be the 5th outside linebacker over a 6th corner. But if they do keep a 6th corner, I think that player, at least today, we'll see again. We got one more game, and that could move the needle in any player's direction, because it's a 3-man race. But I think right now Brooks should get the nod over the other 2. I think Brooks is a better defensive player than Anthony Johnson is, and I think he's going to bring more on special teams than Kevin King is. But we'll ultimately see on that. Now, when you heard me at the beginning of the episode say Natrone Brooks gave a starting caliber performance against the Ravens, what I meant by that is that what you saw from him is exactly what I think is the biggest factor in determining who's going to be that starting outside corner between Clark Phillips and Mike Hughes, right? That ability to come downhill and be that reliable open field tackler, as we saw Natrone Brooks lead the team with 13 tackles and several of them being some outstanding open field tackles, right? That to me, going back to a conversation we had at the beginning of the summer, which when I said, that Mike Hughes was very likely to be the front runner to win the starting outside cornerback spot, that was, to me, the defining reason why. Because when you play as much off-zone coverage as the Falcons are likely to play this year, the Jimmy Lake and Raheem Morris taking over the defense, you need guys that can come downhill and get the ball carrier on the ground. And Natrone Brooks showed you exactly how that is supposed to look in that game. That's what I mean, starting caliber. I don't mean Natrone Brooks should be the starter. I mean, that's what you want from your starting cornerback. And that's the biggest weakness with Clark Phillips that continues to get overlooked by a lot of folks, because Clark Phillips has much more coverage upside than probably any of these other cornerbacks do, right? And I understand why people tend to think that, hey, you're a cornerback, your job is to cover wide receivers. Yes, that is your primary job. But given the scheme that the Falcons are going to play, you have to be able to tackle. And that's a big weakness of Clark Phillips. You haven't really seen that consistency to be able to come downhill and make those tackles. And again, that's a big reason why I say like Clark Phillips is not really adding a whole lot on special teams because, he's too small to block on some of these, returns, and he's not necessarily as physical as you want to be able to run downfield and cover and whatnot. But, I think when you understand what zone coverage is meant to do, right? It's basically a trade-off when you play zone and as much zone as we're expecting this team to play under Jimmy Lake, right? It's the idea of we're going to concede completions. I'm sorry, receptions. I was conceptions, completions or receptions, right? We're going to concede those, but we're not going to concede yards. That's kind of the trade-off that you're making with zone coverage, and you need to have reliable tacklers in the open field. Mike Hughes has proven that he's a much more effective tackler in the open field, especially when he's been an outside corner, right? And the same thing with Natrone Brooks. And again, that's what I mean when I say that's a starting caliber performance. That's exactly how it's supposed to look for that starter. Just put a number 21 or a 22 on Natrone Brooks's jersey instead of 35. Imagine that, and that's what it's supposed to look like. So I want to make that point there. But, as I said earlier, I'm leaning towards that 26th defender if the Falcons do wind up keeping that guy. Because, again, I think that last spot, if we're talking about a 26th defender, right, with 24 players kept on offense, versus 25 players kept on offense and 25 on defense, like that last spot on offense is probably a 9th offensive lineman. So it's going to be potentially like Javon Gwynn or Kyle Hinton versus one of these 6 corners or a 5th outside linebacker. And again, right now I'm leaning towards that 5th outside linebacker and DeAngelo Malone being that spot. But again, it's a little bit of a toss-up between him and Demone Harris at this point in time. So we'll see how it goes. And, it may just kind of boil down to how healthy this roster is going into week 1, like where they feel like they need an extra body at, right? Like, for example, let's say the Falcons, even though Matthew Judon has been practicing throughout the summer, maybe the Falcons aren't 100% high on his ability to come in week 1 and play 40, 50 snaps that you normally would as a starting outside linebacker in his defense. And so the Falcons want to kind of ease him into it and keep him on a little bit more of a pitch count. That would then compel them to keep that 5th outside linebacker on the roster, someone like a Demone Harris, someone like a DeAngelo Malone, so that they can sort of allow Judon to play a limited number of snaps. So those are the variables, the unknown variables that we won't really know about until, a week or plus from now in terms of that. So that's why this thing is so fluid. But I think we're really talking about 6 roster battles at this point in time, kind of going back to the beginning of training camp where we talked about 6 position battles in terms of starting spots. And seemingly all of those were pretty settled after the first preseason game. Again, I guess technically the weak side linebacker position is still open. We don't know between Troy Anderson and Nate Landman who's going to be that guy. I would guess week 1, that's probably going to be Nate Landman just because he's going to give you a better matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are going to certainly try to run the football under Arthur Smith. Thereafter, I don't know if it'll just be matchup based. Then thereafter, it'll probably be more like, especially against the Eagles, where you want to have someone who can spy the quarterback like Jalen Hurts. Troy Anderson makes a lot more sense in that game to start that game. So, it may just be like week to week, the Falcons deciding who gives them the best matchup to be who that starting weak side linebacker is. But the other spots were the outside quarterback spot, Mike Hughes pretty much locked that down. The strong safety spot, I guess we'll never know if Richie Grant and DeMarco Hellams were going to be in a serious battle, but it seemed like Richie Grant was getting the bulk of the snaps. And then, of course, DeMarco Hellams gets injured. And for those of you wondering where Hellams is, I think he's going to be on the short-term IR, so he won't be on the 53-man roster when the season starts. He'll go on the injured reserve, and then we'll see when he comes back during the season. What were the other battles? Nose tackle Eddie Goldman pretty quickly won that after the first game, and number 3 wide receiver Ray McLeod pretty quickly won that one. So I'm sure I might be blanking on another position battle that we were talking about, but pretty much all of those were pretty much locked up right from the jump early in training camp. So we did not get nearly as much, back and forth competition as we thought we were heading into training camp. And so now it's really down to these last few roster spots that are really the compelling position battles at this point in time. If you care about who's going to be 48 through 53, basically most of these guys that we're talking about fighting for these last spots are probably not going to be on the active roster on a regular basis. Some of them will be, but for the most part, these are going to be just like the last few guys on your roster, on your 53-man roster, that will be inactive during the season, but or that sort of emergency option in the event of injury. So we'll see on that front, but we'll wrap up today's Locked On Falcons with the final word on the decision to sit Michael Penix. Right, this will be the end of that conversation here on the podcast, but I've heard a lot of bad takes over the last 24 hours on why the Falcons chose to sit Michael Penix, and I'm going to push back a little bit on that. And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, you have heard me talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And now we're offering a little something different for you, because now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With your YouTube base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. And I am a customer of YouTube TV. I am a customer of NFL Sunday Ticket, especially for those of us, and I know many of my listeners are not necessarily local to the state of Georgia, so they do not get those local in-market games. This is a great opportunity for you to, join and be able to check out every single moment of Kirk Cousins launching bombs, of Drake London and Bijan Robinson busting runs, and Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons and Jesse Bates, cheating and making all these plays throughout the regular season. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you can download America's #1 sportsbook. And while you're there, why not go check out the line for the upcoming Week 1 action between the Falcons and Steelers, where the Falcons are currently favored by 2.5 points. That line may potentially move now that the additions the Falcons have made on the defensive side of the ball. So take advantage of that opportunity right now, or take advantage of Georgia's odds to win it all in the national championship, plus 280. I already put some money on that myself, because I figure those odds aren't going to be any better tomorrow than they are today. So might as well take advantage of it again. Go visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. So let's wrap up talking about Michael Penix and the decision to sit him on Saturday. Don't plan on this being a talking point after today, but Raheem Morris made a choice. I don't agree with the choice, but I don't think he made the wrong choice, right? And let me make that clear, because again, I think a lot of people are going to make it a right versus wrong, and when it's really a right versus left, if you get my drift on that one. The reason why they chose to sit Penix was completely about injury risk mitigation, right? That Raheem has been very open on why he doesn't like playing guys in the preseason. It's not because preseason doesn't matter. It has everything to do with injuries, right? And I've heard too many people over the last 24 hours trying to make the argument that the reason why Penix sat is because preseason doesn't matter, right? It's about injury risk. Now, what exactly is the injury risk that exists for Michael Penix or anybody else playing in the preseason? It's about 3 to 5% chance of them getting hurt, seriously injured. Again, I'm not pulling those numbers out of my butt, right? You go back to the previous game against the Dolphins, right, where the Falcons had 2 injuries in that game, but over 60 players played. That's about a 3% risk factor. I looked up what the 2 teams that had an average number of injuries last year, Pittsburgh and Seattle last year, and in between them, on average, about 35 players appeared on their injury reports after week 1 of last year, which to me works out to be about 5% of their players in any given game are at risk of suffering an injury that will put them on the injury report and potentially keep them out of the following week's game. Now, of course, we know that football players get nicked up throughout the season. It's inevitable, but we're talking about injuries that are serious enough that, you're going to be on the injury report. That's about 5%, right? And, it's not to sit here and say that 3 to 5% is an insignificant number. Now, normally we'd say, anything less than 5% is not statistically significant. But if you, in any context, if you worked a job where, on a weekly basis, you had a 3 to 5% chance of suffering some serious injury, people would say you have a very dangerous job, right? And so football is no different in that regard. But I want to make note of that because, again, I think some people are sort of implying that the injury risk to Penix or any other player that plays in the preseason is some number like 30 to 50% as opposed to 3 to 5%. And I just want to push back against that notion. Now, when it comes to preseason not mattering, it depends on who you're talking about. Context matters, right? For Younghoe Koo, preseason doesn't matter, right? He's an established player in this league. I'm not worried about 3 missed kicks in a single preseason game, because I've seen Younghoe Koo kick 180 some odd field goals over the course of his entire professional football playing career. And for other established veterans like Younghoe Koo that have been in the league for 4 or 5 years, 7 or 8 years, 10 to 12 years, yeah, preseason doesn't matter to them, right? They gain nothing from playing in the preseason because they've played in 80 or 180 real NFL games, and that means way more than anything they could do in the preseason. However, if you're a young player like Michael Penix and you haven't established yourself in this league, preseason does matter. Every rep that you get in a preseason game is going to help you to become that established player in the NFL, right? And when I see people saying like preseason and practice are like basically the same thing, that's not true. I think people are misconstruing some of the things that Raheem is saying, right? Raheem values practice over preseason, not because they're equal, right? It has everything to do with injury risk, guys. He has been very open about saying this, right? It's really about controlling, right? A coach can't really control things in the game, right? He has better control over how tempo goes in practice, right? Because guys aren't going 100% in practice, right? But once the game starts, you lose all of that control. And so that's the reason why Raheem doesn't want to play. It's about control. It's about injuries, guys. It's not about, well, preseason doesn't matter. And the last thing I'll push back again, because this to me is the dumbest take of them all, if I can be so frank, is the idea that, well, Penix has played more snaps than Ridder played last summer, right? And it's like, yes, Michael Penix had 16 dropbacks this summer and Ridder only had 10 dropbacks last summer. But did you not forget the 200 dropbacks that Ridder had his rookie season, right? 64 in the preseason, 136 in the regular season. 216 are not the same, ladies and gentlemen, right? If a stranger walked up to you and said, and handed you $16 and said, have a blessed day, and you'd be like, oh, thank you. You'd be happy. You'd be skipping down the street. And then you hear that same stranger behind you going up to the next person, handing them, here's $200, have a blessed day. You'd stop, you'd turn around, and you'd be like, wait a second. Why did that person get $200 for 16? 216 are not the same. Make that clear. If you skipped math, okay, some people out there seemingly have. So I do think every in-game rep that Penix gets, preseason or regular season, matters for his future development. I don't think I've yet to see anybody argue that, quarterbacks don't need to play in order to develop. Like that's no one's ever made that case before, right? And especially every rep that Penix gets now is going to be beneficial, because starting in roughly 2 weeks, he's not really going to practice that much, because backup quarterbacks don't really practice that much in season, right? Now, I'm sure the Falcons, because they have 6,000 quarterback coaches, are going to come up with some other way to try to develop Penix behind the scene, and he's going to get some different type of unorthodox works that, maybe is not standard around the rest of the league. But I still think he would benefit from whatever that plan is, plus playing in preseason games. So, why not both, right? You get the best of both worlds. But as I said, I don't think Raheem Morris is wrong. I just disagree with him. I'm sure there are plenty of you that disagree with me, but, we'll see. So we will put that to bed. Is not to say that it won't come up once or twice as I complain about it later this week. I'm sure me and Jarvis will definitely not talk about it in the lead up to that Jaguars game or complain about it during that week. So I will not belabor the point any further. I don't think this team did Michael Penix any favors with his development this summer and their usage this summer. We'll see if that changes next summer, but we'll just sort of put that issue to bed. But, just wanted to push back against some of the narratives I've heard that like preseason doesn't matter. And it's like, sure, to Kirk Cousins, it doesn't matter, but to Michael Penix is everything. So, just like it is for any young quarterback that has never played professional football before. So, that's what I wanted to say. But that is going to do it for us, guys. Tomorrow, we'll see what's up. We got a Falcons historian shootout, the final one with Matt Ryan, coming later this week. We have some guests coming up later this week. I'm sure we'll talk more about, the big defensive additions and what it means for the team. I think we'll have a guest coming on to talk about the impact to the Raheem Morris defense. We'll have Cody Alexander of Match Quarters come back on later this week. At least that's the plan. So make sure you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Football, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every